What's going on, guys? So welcome to the IS300 wire extension video part 2. In this video I will be pulling about 50 wires that I've prepped already, just pretty much pulling them into the interior, and that is half of the IS300 wire harness. All this stuff will be found in the progress bar down below if you want to click on the progress bar and jump throughout different sections of this video. It makes it a lot easier than just watching it from start to finish. In the last video, I covered a lot of the necessary stuff, but this video is going to be the meat and potatoes. Like the last video was all the veggies, pretty much. Like everything that needed to be done, the prep work, the cutting open the donor harness. I showed how to remove the IS300 ECU that's in the box in the engine bay. And I showed how to cut into the factory wire harness carefully so that you can expose the wires and figure out what you want to pull into the interior. If you're doing it the way that I'm doing it, there's a bundle of glue that glues about 100 wires together as they go into the firewall. So you pretty much need to separate all of those wires individually from the glue. That's the hardest thing to do with this because you're pulling on a wire, pulling on another wire, pulling on another wire. It's a tight area to work in. Anyway, all that is in the last video. It's some necessary stuff to look at, especially the part where I'm depinning the 2003 RAV4 harness, because the way that I am running the wires into the interior, I'm also depinning the IS300 harness. So all that's in the last video. And if you want to see how to depin the harness, you pretty much have to go to my last video. It would be stupid for me to include the same things in part 2 that I talked about in part 1. That's just being redundant. So on to what I've been doing. So between the last video and this video, what I realized when I started getting into the wire harness, I printed out this diagram, and it's a really good diagram. It's actually like 95% accurate to this car. I realized that some of my wires are different on this wire harness than what is in this wire diagram from 2JZ Garage. And this is a 2002 IS300. You can run the VIN and verify. I'm not going to give you my VIN, but this is definitely a mid-2002 IS300. This, as it says on the bottom, is a diagram for 2002 IS300s. But I'm pretty sure, this doesn't say anywhere, but I'm pretty sure that this is an automatic IS300 diagram. Mine's a manual, factory manual. There's a few wires that are in the wire harness like these up here that I've already extended. There are 3 that their colors aren't even mentioned on the in that wire diagram, and that's these 3 here. This blue one with a yellow stripe, the light green one with a red stripe, and then the regular green one with a red stripe. These all go here under the headlight somewhere to something. I don't know what they go to. There is some other wires that are extra that it mentions in that diagram that are not on this car. And there's some other wires that it says that it's one color, but when I got into it, there's actually a different color wire on that ECU plug. And nobody has gotten this deep into the wiring to where somebody could have switched those wires, taken out wires, put wires in somewhere. Like that hasn't happened on this car. The previous owner didn't do that, I know for sure. Those differences in wiring are most likely due to this being a factory manual transmission IS300 and the other one being an automatic. So I started making notes on this. This is a 2002 factory manual, and if you have a 2002 factory manual, you're in luck because I pretty much did all of the hard work and put on that sheet what wires go into what spot on the connector. So all the diagrams and stuff, it will be on my website. I have to build out that web page, but those diagrams are going to be on the website eventually, and you can find those links in the description. And along with any other information that's applicable to this video, that should be on the website. I have a completely different head going on. I want this to look neat. I'll be snaking my wires around a different way. I'm actually going to be pulling them around the back side of the manifold. I'm only going to video the section where I'm cutting off all of this stuff around my wire harness around the engine. If you want to watch that, you can watch that, but I'm not going to video everything that I'm doing because the basics of what I'm doing, all these wires that come around the front side of the intake manifold, they will very much be in the way. So I need to run these to the back of the firewall, plus it'll look a little bit cleaner. The VVTi solenoid here, the fuel injectors, that all of this comes forward here and it meets up with the knock sensors that are underneath the intake manifold, the cam sensor that's on the back of the engine. So all of those come through this wire loom here. It's going to be flipped around and it's going to go back, and then it's going to go over here and then go down into the interior. So that's pretty much how I'm going to do mine. Even though it's difficult, I'd like to do it while it's on the engine. It allows me to precisely lengthen each wire the length that it needs to be. It's a little bit more painful because you're working around all these metal engine parts. I'll probably record the part of the video of me cutting into this part of the harness that goes onto the engine so that you guys know how to do it if you're going to do it, and you know how to do it safely, and you're more confident in doing it because you're watching somebody else do it. So I'm probably going to do that, but I'm not going to show me making my custom wiring because there's a 90% chance that you're not making your harness the same way that I'm making my harness. But if you're just extending your wire harness into your interior and you're not building a completely custom engine wire harness, then that's really easy because all you have to do is start extending these wires and running them into the interior. One of the things that's very important with making your own wire harness is keeping the wires that are shielded still shielded. The wires that are shielded on the IS300 harness, there are 4 O2 sensors. Each one has its own shield. There's a cam and a crank position sensor. Each one kind of has its own shield, but it looks like on the wire diagram that the cam and the crank sensor, the 2 wires have one shield that goes around each one of the 2 wires, but also the cam and the crank sensor, they each share a wire. Even though they're in different locations, somehow they share a wire. So I'm not sure how Toyota made this wire harness based on looking at the diagram. And then also the knock sensors, I think they share a shield. We'll find that out more when I get into the engine harness. Expect that there will be at least 8 shielded connections. If you're doing an engine management and you're not running any O2 sensors, then you just cut your shielded wires that you need in half. So you don't even have to worry about that. So anyway, with all of that said and out of the way, I can start pulling this fat bundle of wires into the interior. So between the last video and this video, in addition to going through and making that and just spending so much time figuring out what wire color is what and what goes into the connector and double checking, triple checking everything, I've been prepping this whole bundle of wires here to where I can pull them all as one in through the firewall so that they will be in the interior. Once you get the bundle of wires through the firewall, you have 3 feet of area to move the wires throughout the interior. And in order to get them to this point, there's a very painstaking process of unwrapping these wires from these wires. They're all twisted around and tangled around. So I had to depin a lot of these connectors and then snake the wire around all these wires here, this wire bundle here, and then plug it back into the same spot. Very time consuming and tedious. I have this all ready to pull into the interior. I extended this, I think this is 8 wires here. I had to buy some 14 gauge wire, and that's this speaker wire, it's stranded wire. I had to buy that so that I could extend this, this, and this. So these 3 wires that go into this relay box here, those will be pulled in through the firewall also. I'll be running those separately after I pull all of that through the firewall. 3 of these wires are the ones that I was talking about that seem to be for the manual transmission model only. I don't know what they go to. If somebody knows, please include them down below and I'll pin your comment to the top. I've soldered and heat shrink them and labeled them, most importantly, so that I know where to solder them back to over here. And I will pretty much be pulling those in through the interior. After that, I'll be cutting and extending all of these. That's the section of the harness that goes up and snakes around here. So what you can do, if you're leaving your engine just like this, you can leave this harness entirely intact, don't mess with anything else, and start cutting and extending these wires as they are here and pulling them into the engine bay and then soldering them back to the connector. So I'm going to set up my camera on the tripod and start pulling the wires in from the engine bay into the interior and connect them into this block. Now it looks like, based on the length of the wire, that I'm only really going to get the ECU down here to be just under my feet, which means that it's going to be in my floorboard for a little bit while I'm driving around. If you want to, you can extend each one of your wires individually and you can move it up, and you can put it, I guess, up there if you want to. I've seen online where people put them under their seat, and I've also seen where people take out their passenger airbag and they put the ECU over there. I still have to figure out where I'm going to put my ECU, but first things first, I want to get the ECU here into the interior. Okay, and the wiring mess is no more. Now it's more of an organized chaos than the mess than it was before. All the wires have been pulled through. It was a little bit more difficult than I thought because the connectors kept getting hung up over there, and then I fed these, I think they're like 8, 9 wires in through the interior. These 2 wires have already extended on the plug side where they used to go, and I have them labeled in the section that they go, but I have like 6 or 7 feet of the blue wire with the black stripe, and then this brown ground wire extended on the other side of the connector, so I'll just have to backfeed that back through the firewall whenever I figure out the length that I want the harness to be. And these I'm going to have to start cutting and extending one by one, but this will also be whenever I know the exact length of what the harness is going to be in the interior. I'm planning on having enough wire soldered to each one of these to where each one of these plugs can reach the front seat. So that's the plan. And you're thinking, well, how are you going to do that with the RAV4 harness? Well, last night I found a Facebook Marketplace find of a 2010 Tacoma harness that was like 10 minutes from where I live. So picked that up, and I spent this morning opening that up and separating the shielded wire from all of that. And then this I'm going to use, these were the connectors for the 6 individual ignition coils that are on the Tacoma, and they're already pre-wired with the power wires and the ground wires splitting off to each one of these connectors. So it's wired really well. I like the way Toyota does their factory wiring, and I'm going to keep that because it's a good way to bundle 6 wires together, and that's what I'm going to use for my individual ignition coils. I just got to repin it because there's 4 pins on the Toyota, and the R35 coils that I will be using on the IS300, they are 3-pin, where these are 4-pin. It's a different style of coil. So each one of these wires that are now in the interior, I'm going to work on extending little by little, just to get everything to where it's about 3 feet longer than what it is. Some wires are pretty long as they are because they stretched from the front of the engine bay all the way down, and they plugged into this block down here. So some of those, I just have to isolate those, and they'll be long enough to run from here to the back. I just have to figure out how many of those wires there are and then isolate those. I'm gonna have to cut them and resolder them just to get them away from all these other wires. It still looks like a mess, but it's a better mess than what it did before because all of that is looking more like I want it to look. This is the long, tedious part. All the hard stuff is out of the way. This is the long, tedious part. So I'll be cutting and extending about 100 wires, which means that's 200 solder points. It's gonna be fun. And then I have this clothespin contraption that I made. It's just 2 clothespins screwed to a piece of wood. So that allows me to clip 1 wire on one side and 1 wire on the other side, and the wire, it's not pulling while I'm trying to solder. It's like my 3rd and 4th hand that I can clip on the wires so that it holds the wires together while I'm soldering. Pretty helpful little tool, and you have the stuff at your house to make them. All right, so this phase 1, step 1, whatever. These are all the wires that I showed at the beginning of the video that were spread out all throughout the engine bay. So these are all good now. They're all pulled through, and they're here, and they're long enough to where they can go under my seat. So what I'm gonna do is just peel up the carpet that comes up with this little door threshold thing when this is popped up, and just put it under the edge of the carpet for now, and then just put the factory ECU under here, under the seat. So that's where that's gonna go just for now. That'll be temporary. And then whenever I put the engine management on, I actually have to wire a plug-in. So I will probably be extending the harness from this point a little bit further so that I can have a little bit more freedom in where I put the engine management. Put it in a safer place than just under the seat. So of the 80 or so wires that are here, there are about roughly 20 wires that go between these connectors and these little these plugs over here, and then about 10 wires that are long enough to where they go into the engine bay. That leaves about 50 that I had to cut and solder and extend. Some of them were this larger gauge, some were like 12 gauge, and then most of them were 18 or 20 gauge wires. And then coming over here, you see it's a lot better now. All the wires that were here spread out throughout the engine bay, they're now pulled into the interior and all taped up. And I put them all back in the wire loom, with the exception of this section by the firewall that's still outside of a sheath. That I'm going to bundle up and everything when I'm done running the wires around the engine and everything that I have to do. But there aren't any more wires that are going into this, so I just put the sheath back around it to make it look neat, and then put that little relay box back in where it bolts into the strut tower. So these wires, as they are, you can pull them back to this point. That's as far back as they'll go. And this, you can unbolt this bracket and probably turn it 90 degrees so that you can clip this back into it and it stays stationary and it doesn't move around and rub against something and then cause a short by rubbing through a wire. But with all of these back here, these are roughly 6 inches from the firewall. So once you get them into the firewall, you'll need about 4 or 5 feet to mate it back up with there. And that's per wire for all of these wires. And there are a lot of them. So this is actually my mistake. I actually thought the video was recording this whole time. So I have like an hour of work that I just did cutting open this harness and none of it is recorded. So just walking through it, talking through it, it's actually not bad. It's just a little bit harder because it's on the engine. The two parts that I had the most trouble with, well, I'm having the most trouble getting this out. I've loosened the 2 nuts that are on it. There's one nut that goes down here. You kind of have to put your 10 mil and extension down. Where was it at? Yeah, it's like right down there to loosen that. And the other one is back here. So it's down about 6 inches or so. So once those 2 are loose, technically this should just slide right out, but it's not. I know the plugs are still connected, but I can't get it off of the stud that the nut holds the little harness section down on. So that's a little complicated. It looks like I'm gonna have to take this whole upper part of the intake manifold off. I think I'll have to remove the throttle body anyway because these 3 coil plugs, they go under there. But all of this plastic was brittle enough. This is a 20-year-old car, so it's had, you know, almost 200,000 miles on the engine. That's a lot of heat. So that's ruined the plastics that held this. So where it bolts down over here, it was cracked off, and everywhere else it was just kind of crumbling. I was being a little rough with it, but plastic usually bends, right? And this plastic was crumbling and falling apart. So it's not going to be reused. This was a little complicated getting off. There's a nut that holds it down that was there. So this was a little tricky getting out. It's got this heat shielding stuff in the way that has really just been crumbling. I'm gonna have to replace this. There's a little clip here that sits on the underside. There's a bracket that's kind of just under the throttle body down there. It sits on the bottom side of the bracket. This comes off pretty easily. It's just a basic clip thing. There's a bunch of these spread out all around the engine. And then getting this off, you pretty much just put a screwdriver down in there and wedge it so that it releases that tab. And then this whole clip comes off of the harness. This is broken, like most of the connectors on this engine that will be replaced. This is the throttle body motor. So that's the one that goes here, and this little pigtail that hangs off of the motor. So these I'll be running back towards the back of the firewall and then running across. So I shouldn't really need this heat shielding anymore because this will be going back kind of away from the manifold. And it doesn't look like I can remove the heat shielding intact. So make a note of that. If you're going to be rerouting your wires and they're still going to be around that exhaust manifold, you are going to have to destroy the original heat shield. This is melted a little bit. All right, so I'm just gonna have to call this as the end of part 2. It looks like I'm gonna have to take this whole upper part of the intake manifold off. 1, to get this out, but 2, to get these 3 ignition coil plugs off so that I can begin running the wires back from here and then running these wires back to the back of the firewall and then over to that hole. If you've gotten it to this point, then this is really easy. You could actually just redress up these wires, and if you didn't cut all this sheath off like I did, then this little bracket looks like it can be picked up from here and then bolted in right there to whatever this weird thing is. And then instead of snapping it in where the wires came this way, you pretty much turn the wires 90 degrees, snap them in there, and then you can extend them from here. And then you have about 6 inches from these plugs to the firewall to where they go into the hole. Make sure the wires don't rub on anything. Put extra zip ties around things if you need to. Getting in the interior, you probably need about 5 feet of wire for each one of these wires. And when I counted them, I just did like a quick count, but there's roughly 70 to 80 wires. So if you're extending each one of these individually, I would, if it were me doing it this way and just extending these wires, I would have 5-foot sections, 5 or 6-foot sections of wires if you want a little extra, but have the 6-foot sections of wires, all the exact same length. Cut them, solder them, each one in, one at a time, and then have this as one long connector that you pull in through the firewall, the same way that I pulled the other harness through the firewall. The other ways that you can do it is you can get a donor harness from another IS300, preferably one that is if yours is a manual, get one for a manual. If yours is an automatic, get one from an automatic. Someone's parting them out. Someone wrecked theirs on the forums online, that they say that they're parting it out, or on Facebook in one of the IS300 groups, they say that they're parting it out. But that's pretty much it for this video. The next video, the part 3, is I'm just going to show the finished product of the engine, and the wires run everywhere that I need them to run back to the firewall, and then goes over there. So I'll talk about how many wires I had to extend and everything if somebody wants to do that same exact thing. This is going to be a lot of work though. Mainly getting this whole thing off is, yeah, that's going to be a decent amount of work. So thanks a lot for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and God bless you guys.